Greetings, people of Pinkbike. Dario here with the Knolly Warden. So, Knolly says that this is the most capable pedal bike in their lineup, their most composed descender. So it felt fitting to come here to Grouse Bike Park to give it a test. I've been riding it for the past few months. I have a lot of long-term thoughts on the bike, and I want to run you through, a quick ride on the bike, talk about climbing, descending, the geometry, the livability, and finally what I think of it. So stay tuned, we'll run through all that, and for now, let's head out on the trails. I'm gonna take this brief fire road climb to talk a bit about climbing, which incidentally is kind of a talk about shock setup. Because this bike has very low anti-squat and a pretty active feeling suspension on the climbs, how supportive and efficient it feels is gonna end up relying a lot on your shock setup. So I'll kind of chat through what I've ended up doing to make it feel ideal for me. And I'd say the biggest hurdle was figuring out sag for me. I've been just creeping up in air pressure and have gotten to a pretty happy spot in like the mid 20% sag range. And I am running a decent bit of low speed compression as well all the time. Sometimes I'll lock it out on the climbs. It's a good lock switch bike, if you have to call anything that, but it definitely benefits from locking the suspension out. I could even see some people running this with like a Neo or flight attendant type thing. Otherwise, yeah, it's got a lot of good grip on the climbs, but you are always kind of, let's say, balancing between support from the shock and grip at the rear wheel. Same goes on the descent, but I'd say it's more of a delicate balance on the climbs, because in order to get the bike to feel like it's supportive and efficient on the climbs, you are going to be giving up some of that rear wheel grip. So kind of a tricky thing, but worth playing with, and ultimately depends a lot on the terrain you're riding. I am going to run you through the geometry of the Warden here, which Knolly calls a free ride focused geometry package. I would say generally that holds true. It's got some pretty extreme numbers, which hopefully will suit extreme terrain. First thing worth highlighting is the fact that it has a lower shock mount adjustment that allows you to change the geometry. It's primarily affecting bottom bracket height and the head tube and seat tube angles. Speaking first about the head tube angle, because that's common across all the sizes, you are either opting between 63¼ or 62½ degrees. So either option is very slack. The slack one is extreme. I would say it's like firmly in the downhill bike territory. And even the steeper of the two modes does still feel quite, the wheel's far out in front of you. Paired with that, the seat tube angle is 77 or 77¾ so plenty steep. Feels like it's right in the middle of the bike. I'm swapping the shock position to change the geo up so I can get a sense of how it feels. I'm gonna say huge kudos to Knolly on making this like the easiest possible geometry flip chip I've used. It's just one bolt and that's it. Obviously multi-toolable, and as long as you get it tight enough, you're good to go. The chainstays are fairly short for how long the front center is, so you do have to do some conscious forward weighting on some technical terrain, but my size large here has a 442 mil stay, and they scale a little bit per size. Knolly is really big on long reaches, so this bike here, size large, has a 508mm reach, and it's worth reinforcing the idea that you're not buying this bike based on the t-shirt size, but based on the geometry that makes sense for you. They also have very low stack heights, so that's another thing worth factoring in. As you can see here, I'm running all the spacers, and I put a riser bar on this bike to make it fit me better. But the native stack on this size large is 628mm, so I would say pretty extreme on the low end of things for a 170mm enduro bike. Other little details worth noting: the bottom bracket drop is either 0.5 mil or 9.5 mil, depending on the position of the flip chip. So pretty high BB, but the idea there is that you'll be dynamically riding a little lower depending on how you set the shock up. That's about it for geo. For all of the full range of sizes, head to the article because I have all the numbers up there. For now, I'm gonna head back out, talk through the descending portion of this bike. To me, this kind of terrain is the ideal use case for the Knolly. Just junky, full of holes, where you want your feet to be level because there's stuff that they might catch on, but you also want to maintain speed. I mean, I'm really impressed by the suspension performance through this. I feel like it's also where you can ignore some of the stranger geometry elements because you're just pointing the bike down a chute, and like, yes, there are corners here, but like, they're less of a factor than how well it does through Chunder. Really, I think it's just like the quiet feel through the feet that I'm impressed by. And then the ability to slow down, like when this sort of stuff gets steeper, is impressive. Like you can creep choppy stuff without feeling too bounced around or out of place. The very low front end is honestly a bummer. Kind of, no matter how you square it, I think I've been able to get around it with some setup things here, but in my mind, that's ultimately just a compromise when you could just make the stack taller, but strokes for folks. All right, I'm gonna actually creep this chute because in a way it's like one of the more impressive things about this bike is how slow you can go through gnarly steep tech. It's just kind of like gobs of traction, makes it really easy to shut it down when you want to. You know, it's not quite as supportive as you might want on these like kind of cruisy jumps, but if you have enough speed, you're there. It's just kind of it is a speed determined thing as to how well this bike jumps. Speaking about the livability of the Warden, I would say this bike does a very good job of staying in one piece. I haven't really had too many issues with long-term use. All of the bolts are really easily accessible, which I love. It's easy to tighten everything with a multi-tool, which makes a big difference, especially if you're taking it to the bike park a lot, stuff will rattle loose. The flip chip or the like shock adjustment is really easy to do with a multi-tool as well, and you can still get it tight enough. It's just nice to see intent behind where user service items are placed on a bike. You know, not all frames are that way, and it makes a difference. The cable routing is internal and unguided, but luckily stays pretty quiet on this bike. I'm currently running different brakes and didn't want to run them internally, so I've just got them clipped outside, but routing a brake is not too difficult, it just requires a bit of fishing to get it through the frame, but because it goes through so many bends in the frame, it stays quiet from rattling, so that's nice. It is time to give some final thoughts on the Warden. I've had this bike for quite a while. I've ridden it in a variety of terrain, but mostly up here in the Northwest, where it was designed and where I think it makes the most sense. And I want to talk a bit about my final impressions and then who I think this bike is for. Wrapping up the bike, generally this feels like a very focused tool. I think some bikes are generalists and do really well in a variety of situations. I think the Warden really feels suited to a specific type of riding and terrain, and that's things that are steep, things that have features, and generally like raw terrain. It does well in like the rooty, rocky, kind of point in a line and run out type of riding that you might associate with the North Shore, which kind of makes sense because that's where Knolly is based. And that's where I found it did best. I think it struggles a little bit in riding scenarios where cornering balance is key. I think that has a lot to do with the geometry of the bike and the front center, rear center disparity. It feels like you can get good grip balance between the wheels with certain setup concessions and depending on the steepness of trails. So like in steeps, you have a lot of weight over the front anyway, and the super slack head angle starts to make more sense. But on flatter corners or anything unsupported and kind of funky, it can be challenging to get the bike to feel like both wheels are hooking up in a way that is ideal. So definitely feels like a purpose-built machine, and it kind of is. So in that sense, it makes sense. I should talk about the setup things I've done to make this bike work better for me. Chief among them is just getting the bars higher. It has a really low stack height, and that's something I've touched on a few times, and I don't want to beat a dead horse on this, but I understand like the logic of you make a really long reach, a really low stack height, and then you can take in some of that reach by increasing the stack with spacers and with a higher rise bar. But I have ridden plenty of bikes now that have a higher native stack and a longer reach, and they still feel great. So I think I prefer that latter approach of like balancing all of the proportions as opposed to relying on the end user to like bring stack height up to make sense for them. I think a bike like this is meant to be ridden down steep things and should have a high stack height. It's just that simple. Like having a like saddle to bar drop on the native setup that is like as extreme as some cross-country bikes is kind of an odd feeling. And obviously like with a 50 mil rise 1-up bar and a lot of spacers, I'm at a pretty happy medium here, but I think that requires like extra money and setup time for the end user, and you could just have like a better starting point. Other little setup things, you know, I mentioned shock setup. I almost am reluctant to like prescribe anything there because it's going to depend a lot on the end user and what they want out of the bike. It has a very unique suspension feel and one that definitely biases towards grip. It's quite active feeling. And while that's really nice in those like chopped out natural scenarios, I think getting it to feel like it's generating speed in more supportive terrain is a bit challenging without playing with turning the compression further in than you'd expect. So something to experiment with, bracket those settings, just depends a lot on what kind of terrain you're riding. Ultimately, who this bike is for, I think there aren't that many places where a bike with this extreme of geometry makes a ton of sense. Like, there are plenty of steep places around the world, but you're gonna want the right terrain. I think that's what it comes down to. It is just 170 mil front and rear. You can increase that travel with a long stroke, and you can even run a dual crown on this if you want to. So I could see people using this as a park bike. I think it actually makes a decent bit of sense in that capacity. For me, on the size that I've ridden, my understanding of the geometry, it feels like, as I mentioned, kind of like a purpose-built free ride bike for like scraping down the steepest stuff out there. And though it kind of lacks a general feeling of balance, I do think it does those things really well. Knolly's suspension feel is unique. It's something that I actually have been really impressed by. And while the geometry generally is a little confused to me, I do think that elements of this bike are spectacular, really. Like the lack of chain interaction through the feet on rough stuff is really impressive on this bike. So I'd be super curious to ride maybe like a less extreme Geo version, but same suspension package of the bike. Like on many bikes, I'd be curious what it would be like with a longer chainstay. I think that would help with the front rear balance on the bike, but those are like mysteries that I cannot answer in the purview of a normal bike review. So best left to curiosity, but yeah, an interesting bike, one that I think will suit some people, but is definitely not like the one bike quiver, if you will. Head over to the article for all my thoughts and, you know, more in-depth feedback on what settings I used and where I thought this bike shined. Please feel free to subscribe if you're interested. We have more of this coming and a lot of cool Crankworx stuff as well. So stay tuned. Peace.